The sky hung heavy as gray clouds drifted slowly above. Margaret stood on the porch of what used to be her home, clutching a small overnight bag tightly in her hand. Her knuckles whitened around the handle as the wind tugged at the hem of her coat. Behind the locked door, she could hear Max, their golden retriever, barking and scratching softly against the wood, sensing her presence but unable to reach her. She had tried the handle once, twice, then again, her heart pounding louder. With every failed attempt, the door wouldn't budge. The key she once carried no longer fit. The lock had been changed. She stared at it for a moment, as if somehow willing it to turn would make it open. But the cold, unmoving metal answered her with silence. Across the street, the neighbor, Mrs. Kent, glanced up from her flower bed. Their eyes met for a brief second, but then Mrs. Kent quickly turned away, pretending to fuss with a potted plant. The shame burned Margaret's cheeks. She had known Mrs. Kent for years. They used to share holiday cookies, exchange gardening tips. Now, she couldn't even meet Margaret's gaze. Margaret swallowed hard, her throat dry. The sound of Max's paws tapping against the door tugged at her chest. He whined softly, not understanding why she didn't come inside. She wanted to comfort him, to open the door and hold him close. But she couldn't. She was locked out of her own life. Her mind flashed back to the words he had thrown at her only hours before. Words that felt like knives slicing through everything they had built together. "You're just holding me back." His voice had been cold, flat, like all the years they spent together had suddenly meant nothing. She stared down at the welcome mat, the one they picked out together years ago. The word home was written in faded cursive, now mocking her. As she stood frozen outside, what had led to this? What had she done to deserve it? She had supported him through everything. She had been patient, forgiving, loyal. And now, cast aside like a burden he no longer wished to carry. Her eyes stung as she fought back tears. She wouldn't cry here, not in front of the neighbors, not in front of the world that had suddenly become so small. She stood there, breathing, slowly, her chest tight, feeling the cold settle into her bones. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sounds of laughter from the house next door, where a family gathered for dinner. The warmth inside those windows contrasted sharply with the emptiness she felt standing on her own porch. Max let out another soft bark, his voice filled with confusion and longing. Margaret placed her hand gently on the door, pressing her palm flat against it as if she could somehow reach through to him. She closed her eyes, letting the cool surface ground her. She was alone, locked out, abandoned. And as she stood there, staring at the house that used to be hers, something deep inside began to shift, not loudly, not yet, but quietly. Beneath the hurt, beneath the humiliation, a small ember of something else started to glow. The soft hum of the ceiling fan filled the small kitchen as Margaret stood at the counter, carefully slicing apples and tucking them into little plastic bags. She had done this routine for years, packing lunches, folding napkins just so, writing tiny notes to slip inside the bags to remind him he was loved. Even when money was tight, she always found a way to make each day feel a little special. She remembered the early years when they first got married. They had big dreams then, talking late into the night about the life they would build. They started small, with nothing but a rented apartment and secondhand furniture. She believed in him, in his ideas, in his promises. So when the bills piled up and the dreams didn't turn into paychecks, she didn't leave. She picked up extra shifts instead. Margaret worked long hours at the diner, often coming home well past midnight, her feet aching from standing all day. She would quietly change clothes in the dark so she wouldn't wake him. Then she'd rise again before dawn to make breakfast, iron his shirts, and send him off to chase another idea, another plan. She carried them both, her own exhaustion tucked away behind a tired smile. Vacations were always postponed. "Next year," he'd say, "when things settle down." But things never settled. There was always a new project, a new debt, a new reason to wait. She watched friends and neighbors take trips, buy new cars, remodel kitchens. She told herself they didn't need those things. What they had was love, stability, partnership. That was enough. When the credit cards maxed out and the phone calls from creditors started, she found a second job. She juggled both without complaint, keeping the lights on, the mortgage paid, the cupboards full. She skipped doctor appointments, bought her clothes secondhand, and clipped coupons with quiet pride. He failed more than once. Bad investments, lost jobs, broken promises. But each time, she stayed. She stood beside him through every stumble, every disappointment. When his voice turned sharp with frustration, she bit her tongue, choosing peace over pride. She thought that was what loyalty meant. She thought love was about sacrifice, and through it all, her own dreams sat quietly on a shelf. She had wanted to open her own shop once, a small bookstore, maybe a little cafe on the side, a place filled with stories and warm light. But there was never enough money, never enough time. And so, that dream slowly faded into the background. As the years passed, it wasn't a perfect life, but it was hers. She had built it with her own hands, held it together with her own strength. She had loved him, truly, deeply, even when it cost her everything else. And now, standing outside that locked door, clutching a small bag while the dog whimpered behind the glass, she wondered how easily he had let it all go. The life she gave him, years of devotion, quiet sacrifices, endless second chances, meant so little to him now. She wasn't part of his future anymore. She had become an obstacle, a weight he wanted to cast off. Her chest tightened as she replayed his cold words again. "You're just holding me back." For years, she thought loving him was enough, that giving everything would one day be returned with gratitude. But standing here, she realized something else. She had given him everything, but he never truly valued what she gave. The pain sat heavy in her chest, but beneath it, something else stirred, small, unfamiliar, but growing stronger. The house felt unusually quiet that afternoon. Margaret had come home early from work, her shift ending sooner than expected. The air was still, but there was a strange weight hanging in the silence. As she set her purse down on the kitchen counter, her eyes drifted to a small slip of paper sticking out from under the pile of unopened mail. It was a receipt. She picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly before she even read the words. Grandview Hotel. 2 nights. King Suite. Her chest tightened. She stared at the paper, reading the lines over and over, hoping, almost begging, that she was misunderstanding it. But she wasn't. She flipped the receipt, looking for some other explanation, but it offered none. Her hand shook as she set it down. She reached for her phone, unsure what she was even searching for. Then she saw it, a voicemail notification she hadn't listened to yet. She hesitated, her thumb hovering for a long moment before she finally pressed play. The woman's voice was soft, almost playful. "Hey, last weekend was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. Call me when you're free." Margaret's breath caught. The world around her seemed to blur, as though her vision had narrowed into a tight tunnel. Her legs weakened, and she gripped the edge of the counter to stay upright. The front door creaked open behind her. He walked in, humming softly, carrying a bag of takeout like it was just another ordinary day. When he saw her standing there, holding the receipt, the humming stopped. His face shifted, first to surprise, then to annoyance. "Margaret," he sighed. Setting the bag down, "You weren't supposed to see that." Her mouth opened, but no words came. She couldn't even form a question. The weight pressing on her chest was too heavy. He didn't apologize. He didn't even try to explain. Instead, his voice grew cold, as though he was already tired of the conversation. "Look, I didn't plan for you to find out like this, but honestly, it's probably for the best." She stared at him, still frozen. "You've changed, Margaret. You're not the same woman I married. You're older. You don't keep up. We don't have fun anymore." His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "I need someone who matches where I am now. Someone exciting. You've become boring." The words sliced through her. She felt them land in the deepest part of her, but she didn't move. She didn't even blink. "You've been holding me back for years," he added, like it was a simple fact. "I want you out by Friday." Margaret's knees nearly buckled, but somehow she remained standing. Her hands dropped to her sides, fingers curling slightly, trying to hold something, anything of herself, together. He continued speaking, but his words faded into a muffled hum as her mind spiraled. She wasn't even angry. Not yet. The shock numbed everything, after all she had given, after all she had carried, after every debt she paid, every sacrifice she made, every dream she buried. After years of loyalty, patience, forgiveness, this was how it ended. Not with a conversation, not with honesty, but with quiet betrayal and cold dismissal. She didn't scream, she didn't argue. She couldn't. She just stood there, frozen, as the man she had built a life with, protected, supported, loved, finished tearing it all apart without flinching. The betrayal was complete. Her eyes drifted to Max, who sat nearby, his tail still, his wide brown eyes watching her closely, as if sensing something terrible had just happened. In his gaze, she found the only trace of comfort left in that house. The man who once promised her forever simply turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the quiet ruins of what used to be her life. The motel room smelled faintly of old carpet and cheap air freshener. Margaret sat on the edge of the stiff bed, her small suitcase still half unpacked beside her. The buzzing neon sign outside flickered against the thin curtains, casting soft flashes of red and white across the plain beige walls. The room was cold, but she didn't bother adjusting the thermostat. She just sat there, staring at her phone, resting on the nightstand. She had called her son that morning. No answer. She called again in the afternoon. Still nothing. She left a message. "I just need to hear your voice," she whispered into the phone. But hours passed, and there was no reply. She tried her daughter next, straight to voicemail. She texted simple words. "Can we talk?" But the screen stayed silent, no bubbles, no response. They weren't children anymore. They had families of their own, busy lives, excuses that seemed convenient now. Maybe they didn't want to be. Caught in the middle, maybe they believed what he told them, that she was bitter, dramatic, difficult, that this was all somehow her fault. The friends she once shared dinners with grew quiet too. At first, there were a few polite texts. "Let us know if you need anything." But none followed through. Some were closer to him than her, and others simply didn't want the discomfort of choosing sides. The silence from all of them stung worse than any words. And now it was just her, sitting in this motel room that smelled of old stories and forgotten people, scrolling through pictures on her phone. She paused on one, a picture of the four of them on vacation years ago. Smiling faces, arms around each other, the ocean behind. Them. She remembered that trip, how hard she had worked to save enough to make it happen. She planned every detail, packed every bag, made sure everyone was happy. And now, that moment sat frozen behind glass, as distant as if it belonged to someone else's life. Max was the only warmth she had left. In those first few days he curled, up beside her, his head resting gently on her lap as if sensing her heartache. His soft brown eyes followed her everywhere, offering quiet comfort with each wag of his tail. But even that was taken. She returned to the motel one afternoon to find him gone. A cold, short message left on her phone from him. Max belongs here. He'll be better off. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Margaret had stood in the middle of the room, staring at the empty space where his bed once sat, where his leash had hung by the door. The loss of her dog, the only living being who hadn't turned away from her, broke something deeper inside. The days blurred together. She walked to the nearby diner in the mornings for coffee, sat alone in the corner booth, pretending to read the paper while her mind wandered. The waitresses didn't ask questions. They simply poured her cup, smiled politely, and moved along. The evenings were worse. The hours stretched long, the hum of the small motel refrigerator the only sound in the room. She would scroll through more photos, birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, all those years she poured into building a life that no longer wanted her. She whispered sometimes, softly to herself, like a conversation with someone who wasn't there. Words that had no reply. Questions that had no answers. How did we get here? What did I do wrong? The phone stayed silent. The children stayed distant. The friends stayed absent. And so she sat, in the quiet, in the emptiness. The motel. Sign continued its soft, rhythmic flicker through the curtains, casting brief flashes of light across her face as the night dragged on. The motel room was cold again that morning, but Margaret didn't feel it as much. She sat at the small desk, flipping through the few papers she'd managed to grab before he changed the locks. Bank statements, old bills, insurance forms, all scattered loosely across the scratched wooden surface. She hadn't looked at them closely in weeks. She hadn't had the strength. But something inside her had shifted ever so slightly. Her eyes caught a familiar manila envelope at the bottom of the pile. She pulled it out slowly, dusting off a thin layer of lint. Inside were old documents she barely remembered packing, their marriage certificate, tax filings, a few legal papers from the early days of buying the house, and then she saw it. The property deed. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper, scanning the lines carefully. Her heart picked up as her eyes landed on it. Both their names. Hers was right there, printed as clear as day. Margaret Elaine Foster. She wasn't erased, not legally. Not yet. The spark flickered. Small, fragile, but real. She sat back in the chair, staring at the paper, letting the truth sink in. For weeks, she had felt powerless, discarded, like she never mattered. But this piece of paper whispered something. Else, she still had ground to stand on. Without thinking, she picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts. Her fingers hovered before pressing call on a name she hadn't dialed in years. Susan, an old friend who worked in a small law office downtown. They hadn't spoken much lately, but once, Susan had been one of her closest friends. The phone rang twice before Susan's warm voice answered. Margaret? Oh my God! I've been wondering how you were. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat, her voice steady but soft. I need your help, Susan. They met that afternoon at a quiet little coffee shop far from town. Susan listened carefully as Margaret laid everything out. The cheating, the lies, the locks changed, the stolen dog, the silence from the kids. And finally, she slid the deed across the table. Susan studied it carefully, then looked up with a calm but serious smile. He's not as untouchable as he thinks, Margaret. You're still on this house. You have rights. And if he tried to push you out illegally, the courts will see it. Margaret felt her shoulders loosen for the first time in weeks. The weight didn't vanish, but it lifted slightly. And the dog? She whispered. Susan nodded firmly. We'll include everything. As they talked, a plan began to form. Clear, simple, and entirely legal. No screaming, no begging. Just facts. Just truth. Later that week, Susan connected her with a small women's shelter. Margaret didn't need a place to stay, but Susan, insisted she meet the director, a kind woman named Evelyn who had seen too many stories like hers. They sat together in a small, sunlit office. Evelyn offered her tea, speaking with a gentle voice that felt like a warm hand on her shoulder. "You still matter, Margaret," Evelyn said softly. "No matter how they've treated you, no matter what they've said, you're still here. You still matter." Margaret blinked, her throat tightening, but she didn't cry this time. The words settled into her chest like roots, steadying her. That night, back in her motel room, she didn't sit on the edge of the bed staring at old pictures. She didn't scroll through silent text messages or wonder who might call. Instead, she sat at the desk again, organizing her papers into neat piles, each one labeled and ready. She made a list of the steps Susan had outlined. She wrote down questions to ask. Her hands no longer trembled as she worked. The motel neon still flickered behind the curtains. The room was still small, still cold. But this time, the silence didn't crush her. She didn't cry. She planned. The sun filtered through the thin motel curtains. But this time, Margaret woke with a different kind of energy. There was no heaviness pressing on her chest. No waiting for calls that wouldn't come. Today, she had a plan. The first thing she did was drive to the county clerk's office. The parking lot was nearly empty as she stepped inside the small building. The woman behind the glass window greeted her with a polite smile as Margaret slid the deed across the counter. "I need certified copies," she said softly but firmly. Within minutes, she had them in her hand. Crisp, official, undeniable. Her name, her legal claim, printed in black and white. The first brick laid in what would become her quiet wall of defense. Next, she sat down with Susan again. They went through every financial record Margaret had managed to save. Bank statements, credit card bills, tax returns. Line by line, they pieced together a full picture. "He used joint funds for those hotel stays," Susan said, her voice calm but sharp. "He used your shared money for everything." Margaret nodded. She had kept the receipts, the voicemail, the credit card charges. The small details that once broke her now became pieces of her case. They opened a separate account in her name only. Margaret transferred what she legally could into it, securing enough to support herself while the process moved forward. She updated passwords, closed old joint accounts, and contacted her insurance providers. Every move was quiet, private, controlled. Then came the filing. The divorce papers were drafted with care and precision. Susan handed them to her across the polished desk, the legal language filling page after page. "We're not just filing for divorce," Susan explained. "We're filing for fraud, for financial misconduct, for wrongful eviction. You have every right to seek the house, spousal support. And yes, Max." Margaret ran her hand over the documents. The woman who once stood frozen in her kitchen, too numb to speak, now held every piece of her fight in front of her. And yet, she felt no urge to scream, no desire for revenge fueled by rage. She didn't need to raise her voice to win. She had the truth. They filed quietly, serving him through his lawyer. Margaret didn't attend the initial delivery. She didn't want to see his face when he read the demands, how much he owed her, how much he had taken, and how much was legally hers. The phone started ringing shortly after. His number lit up her screen over and over again. She let each call go unanswered. She didn't want his excuses, his bargains, his sudden attempts at kindness. She wasn't here for conversation anymore. He left messages, his tone flipping from angry to apologetic and back again. "We can work this out. You don't need to do this. Think of the kids." Margaret sat at her small motel desk, filing each voicemail away like dust swept into a corner. She didn't respond. While he spun in circles, she moved forward. Every day was a small step, visiting the financial advisor Susan recommended, providing copies of every receipt, every photo, every voicemail. She met with a real estate appraiser, valuing the house they once shared. She prepared a full inventory of everything they owned. She wasn't rushing. She was thorough, steady. The courthouse dates were set. His lawyer tried to push back, to delay, to intimidate. But Susan was ready, and so was Margaret. Each time she walked into Susan's office, Margaret felt stronger. The heaviness that once bent her shoulders had lifted. She carried herself taller now, not because she wanted to prove anything to him, but because she finally saw herself clearly. For years, she had sacrificed, hoping it would earn her love, respect, loyalty. In the end, it earned her betrayal. But now, she was reclaiming what was rightfully hers, not through screaming matches or desperate pleas, but through quiet, controlled power. She was no longer his burden, she was his reckoning. The courthouse stood tall under the clear morning sky. Margaret stepped out of the car, her heels clicking softly against the concrete as she walked toward the entrance. She wore a simple navy dress, nothing flashy, nothing meant to draw attention. She didn't need attention. She only needed the truth. Inside, the courtroom was cool and bright. Rows of empty benches lined the back as she sat beside Susan at the petitioner's table. Across the aisle, he sat stiffly in his chair, flanked by his lawyer, eyes darting toward her, but quickly looking away each time she met his gaze. The judge entered, and the room grew still. Papers shuffled, lawyers stood, and proceedings began. Margaret sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as Susan presented the facts, calm, clear, undeniable. The receipts, the financial records, the proof of infidelity, the wrongful eviction, the joint ownership of the house, the stolen funds, and finally, the cruel act of taking Max. His lawyer attempted to shift blame, to spin stories, but the judge was unmoved. Margaret didn't flinch through any of it. She had already lived through the hardest part. This was simply the final step. Hours passed, but Margaret barely noticed. She listened, steady and still, as her life was laid out in front of the court, not with drama, not with theatrics, but with the quiet power of truth. Finally, the judge spoke. His voice was firm, his words final. The house remains in Mrs. Foster's name, as per the deed. The defendant's actions to evict her without due process were unlawful. The court awards full ownership of the property to Mrs. Foster. Additionally, Mrs. Foster retains custody of the dog. Financial restitution is ordered for misuse of marital funds, and all remaining assets are to be divided equally. Margaret felt her chest rise with one deep breath. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply nodded as the judge finalized the ruling. Her ex-husband's face paled, his jaw tightening as the weight of the decision settled in. But he said nothing. There was nothing left to say. As the court adjourned, Margaret stood, thanked Susan softly, and walked out of the courtroom with slow, steady steps. No rush, no nervousness. She had waited long enough for this moment. Later that afternoon, she pulled into the driveway of the house he had once locked her out of. The same porch where she had stood with tears burning her eyes was now bathed in warm sunlight. She stepped out of the car and approached the front door, keys jingling softly in her hand. She unlocked the door with ease, pushing it open slowly. Max came running immediately. His paws skidded slightly on the hardwood floor as he rushed toward her, tail wagging wildly. He leapt into her arms, his warm body pressing against her as she held him tight, burying her face into his fur. Tears finally came, not from pain, but from relief, from the quiet, full-circle return to where she belonged. The house was quiet, but not empty. The silence no longer stung. It comforted her now. She walked through each room slowly, fingers brushing along the furniture, reclaiming her space one step at a time. The kitchen where she had once packed his lunches, the living room where she had waited long nights for him to come home. The bedroom where she had once whispered silent prayers, begging for things to get better. Now it was hers again, all of it. She stood in the center of the living room, Max at her side, and looked around with calm, steady eyes. There was no need to slam doors or shout or remind anyone of what she had won. The silence was enough, and for the first time in a long time, she exhaled fully, feeling the weight leave her body. She had taken everything back, not by force, not by rage, but by standing her ground and refusing to disappear. The house was quiet, but this time the quiet didn't feel heavy. The sunlight poured gently through the kitchen window as Margaret sipped her morning coffee. Max lay at her feet, his head resting comfortably on her slippers, his tail thumping lightly with every slow breath. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound breaking the calm, steady air. Her phone lit up on the counter. Another call. His name flashed across the screen, but she didn't move to answer. She watched the screen blink, watched the call fade into silence, and then disappear. A minute later, the voicemail icon appeared. She picked up the phone not to listen, but to see the message stack grow. She could already guess the words. Should talk. It was always the same now. Messages filled with half-hearted regrets, awkward attempts at conversations that no longer had a place. He didn't say he was sorry for what he did. He never had. But now, with everything gone, with the house, the dog, and the truth no longer his to control, he wanted dialogue. He wanted to rewrite the story. But she wasn't interested. Not anymore. A few days later, another message arrived, this time from her daughter. "Mom, can we come by sometime? We just want to see you." For a moment, Margaret stared at the text, her thumb hovering over the reply button. She wasn't angry, not bitter, but she remembered the long months of silence, the unanswered calls, the way they had quietly stepped aside, letting her fall while they watched from a distance. She typed back simply, "I'm busy this week, maybe another time." It wasn't meant to punish. It was just honest. The truth was, she no longer waited for their visits. She no longer hoped for anyone's understanding. The person she had fought hardest to hear her was finally listening. Herself. That evening, she clipped Max's leash onto his collar, and the two stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sky glowed with the colors of the setting sun, soft pinks and deep oranges blending into the horizon. The street was quiet, the neighborhood peaceful. As they walked, Margaret breathed in the crisp air, letting it fill her lungs. Max trotted, happily beside her, occasionally glancing up with his wide, warm eyes. For years she had built her life around others, waiting, pleasing, bending to fit what they needed. Now, for the first time in as long as she could remember, her life was her own. There was no tension in her chest anymore, no waiting for the phone to ring, no desperate need to explain herself, to beg for recognition, to hope someone would finally see her worth. They had all made their choices. She had made hers. The walking path curved gently toward a small overlook where she paused, staring out at the quiet town below. The lights flickered gently in distant windows, families gathering for dinner, children finishing their homework. She smiled softly, not out of sadness or longing, but out of peace. She had learned that freedom didn't come from getting people to change. It came from no longer needing them to. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket. She didn't bother pulling it out. She let it vibrate once, twice, then stop. Max sat patiently at her side, leaning into her leg, as if sensing the stillness inside her. She knelt beside him, gently scratching behind his ears, whispering softly, "We're okay, aren't we, boy?" His tail wagged, his warm breath puffing into the cool evening air. The sun dipped lower, and the first stars began to appear. Above, they had called, they had texted, they had tried. But she didn't pick up, and for the first time, she didn't need to. The afternoon sun streamed through the living room windows, filling the space with a soft golden glow. The house was quiet, but not empty. The silence felt full, like warm arms gently holding her instead of pushing her aside. Margaret stood in the center of the room, slowly turning in place, taking it all in. The furniture sat exactly where she wanted it. The kitchen counters were spotless, her favorite coffee mug resting next to the kettle. Fresh flowers stood proudly in a simple vase by the window. The walls were clean and bright, free from clutter, free from reminders of everything she had once tried so hard to hold together. For years, this house had been filled with tension, with the weight of carrying a man who never really saw her. She had spent so much time running after everyone else's needs, trying to keep the peace, sacrificing little pieces of herself one day at a time. But now it was hers, fully hers. Her eyes drifted to the blank wall in the hallway, the one she had always planned to decorate but never quite got around to. Life had been too busy back then. Always something to fix, some new demand pulling her attention. He used to complain every time she brought it up. "We'll get to it later. It's not important." Today, she finally opened the box that had sat in the corner of the closet for years. Inside was the painting she bought long ago, a quiet, little piece she had loved the moment she saw it, a soft watercolor of a field of wildflowers swaying beneath an open sky. Simple, beautiful. Margaret carefully hung the painting on the empty wall, stepping back to admire how the light caught the soft colors. The house finally felt complete. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was honest. It was hers. She sat down on the couch, Max curling up beside her, his head resting gently on her leg. She ran her fingers through his fur, breathing. In the calm around her, her mind wandered, drifting back through the years she had spent giving so much of herself. She thought of the long shifts, the unpaid bills she juggled, the dreams she quietly folded away and placed on a high shelf. She had been called many things over the years, too old, too boring, too much work. Words he had thrown at her like stones when he grew tired of her steady love. But sitting here now, surrounded by the peace she had built with her own hands, she saw the truth. She was never boring. She was never weak. She had been strong, strong enough to carry him, strong enough to survive being cast aside, strong enough to start over when everything she trusted was ripped away. He hadn't left her because she was a burden. He left her because he couldn't handle the weight of her strength, because she stayed steady while he wavered, because she forgave while he betrayed, because she kept standing when he wanted her to fall. Margaret smiled softly, her eyes warm but clear. She wasn't angry anymore. The anger had burned itself out long ago, leaving only a quiet pride. She had been through the fire, and she had come out stronger. She reached for her cup of tea on the side table, lifting it slowly and taking a long, steady sip. The warm liquid spread through her chest like a quiet celebration. The life she had now wasn't the one she once imagined, but it was honest, it was free, and it belonged to her. As the afternoon light shifted and the shadows stretched longer across the floor, Margaret whispered softly to herself, "Maybe I wasn't the burden after all." And for the first time, she truly believed it. The evening. Sun dipped low, filling the dining room with a soft amber glow. The house was still, but not empty. The kind of stillness that felt earned, like a deep breath held for too long, finally let out. Margaret moved through the kitchen with quiet grace, placing a small roast on a platter, the rich scent filling the air. Beside it sat a bowl of fresh vegetables, a small loaf of bread, and a glass of wine poured just the way she liked. Simple, warm, enough. She set a single place at the head of the table. The cloth napkin folded neatly beside the plate. The silverware gleamed softly in the fading light. The house felt full, even though it was just her. Soft music played in the background. Her music, the kind she used to listen to before others rolled their eyes or changed the station. The soft hum of a piano blended with her quiet movements, wrapping around the room like a gentle embrace. Max lay curled up by her feet, his breathing steady, his tail tapping the floor every now and then as if sensing the peace in the air. He didn't need words to understand. He simply stayed close, his presence steady, loyal, and comforting. For years, Margaret had cooked meals for others, for her husband, her children, the friends who came and went. She had spent decades making sure everyone else was full, even when she wasn't. Tonight, she cooked for herself. She took her seat at the table, smoothing her dress gently as she settled in. She paused for a moment, letting her eyes scan the space around her, the soft light, the fresh flowers on the windowsill, the small painting on the wall she had finally hung. All of it was hers. There was no tension in her chest, no waiting for someone to call, no wondering how to make others happy. She no longer felt the need to shrink, to quiet her laughter, to dim her light so others could shine brighter. She had given enough. Now she gave to herself. The first bite was slow, intentional, full of flavor. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the taste settle. It wasn't the food that brought the satisfaction. It was the freedom that sat at the table with her. For so long, she had lived in fear of being alone. She had believed the lie that being unwanted meant being unworthy. But sitting here now, she saw the truth clearly. Being alone wasn't something to fear. It was something she had chosen. Something she had built with her own hands after everything else had been taken. Her smile came softly at first, then stayed. Not a smile for show, not for anyone else's approval or attention. It was hers. The candlelight flickered gently as the music continued to hum in the background. Max shifted at her feet, releasing a quiet sigh of contentment. Margaret looked out the window one last time, watching as the stars began to peek through the night sky, and with a quiet, steady voice, she whispered to herself, words she had waited so long to say. This time, I ate at my table, alone and free. And for the first time, she knew that was exactly where she was meant to be. He thought he broke me, but he forgot. Women like me don't break. We rebuild. And we take the dog.